The wind that winter sounded like a living thing. Not just cold air moving through trees, but something with intention. Something that knew how to hunt.
This
Montana
stone
winter,
fits right
1929.
here.
Jack Sullivan sat by his
Good.
fireplace,
Now
75 years
steady the
old, with hands
beam.
that still remembered the
It's
weight of an
holding
axe.
firm.
His grandson Thomas held a newspaper clipping, confusion
The
written across his
reports
young
are
face.
troubling. We must
Grandpa, this
act
article about
now.
Blackwood
I
Shelter in Wyoming.
agree.
They
What
say a
are our
15-year-old girl
options?
survived
The
an entire
risks
winter
are
on the mountain
high.
in 1888. Is that true?
The
Jack
fire's
stared into the
low.
flames. The silence
Here,
stretched long enough
this
that
will
Thomas almost
help.
asked again.
Thanks.
It's true, Jack said
We'll
finally.
be warm
I found her.
soon.
Why do they call her a hero? Jack's jaw tightened. They don't understand.
Listen,
Clara
it
wasn't a
says
hero.
the cave
She was
holds
just the
a
only person who knew
secret.
how to read the mountain.
Does it?
And that made all
Read
the
on,
difference.
child.
Bonds. Thomas leaned forward. The old man's eyes had gone distant, seeing something 41 years past. Winter of 1888, I was 34. Had been trapping in the Wyoming mountains for 12 years. Thought I understood that country, but a 15-year-old girl taught me something I should have known all along. Jack paused. Knowledge doesn't come from age. It comes from knowing what to observe. December 1888. The wind across the ridgeline carried a different weight that morning. Jack Sullivan crouched in the snow, studying elk tracks that had no business being this low in early winter. 3 weeks too early. The pattern was wrong. He pulled out his aneroid barometer, a battered brass instrument he'd carried for a decade. The needle had dropped faster in the last 6 hours than he'd ever seen. Not just weather changing, something fundamental, shifting in the mountain's behavior. Ravens circled overhead in numbers that made his stomach tight. 400, maybe 500 birds moving in a pattern he'd never witnessed. Not random scavenging, organized, preparing. Jack ran his gloved hand along a pine trunk. The sap had thickened unusual for this early in the season, the tree already hardening itself against cold that hadn't yet arrived. Every instinct he'd developed over 12 winters told him the same thing. This year would be different. He descended toward Ashford Ridge, the small frontier town tucked into the valley below. The settlement looked peaceful in the afternoon light. Smoke rose from 23 cabins. Livestock moved in pens. Men worked at their regular tasks, confident in their preparations. Jack found Warren Frost in the back room of the mercantile checking inventory. The town council leader looked up with tired eyes. "Warren, you need more firewood, considerably more than usual." Frost set down his ledger. "Jack, we have this conversation every November. This year is different. The elk are down 3 weeks early. The ravens are gathering in patterns I've never seen. The barometric pressure has been dropping at a rate that concerns me." Warren's face hardened in a way Jack recognized. Not anger, something older and more painful. "I have 40 years of frontier experience. We'll manage." Jack studied the other man, saw the tremor in Warren's hands that had nothing to do with cold. Post-war nerves, some called it. The kind of shake that came from seeing too much death and carrying too much responsibility afterward. "Just consider it," Jack said quietly. Warren turned back to his ledger. The conversation was over. Walking back through town, Jack felt the wrongness intensify. The wind had shifted from its usual westerly push to something circular, pulling air in patterns that suggested the mountain itself was preparing for something massive. He'd seen men die from ignoring their instincts. But he'd also learned that in a town where every man believed his experience made him wise, suggesting you knew better was a quick way to isolation. He saw the girl the next morning. Jack had climbed back to the ridgeline to check his trap lines when he spotted her, 15, maybe 16 years old, standing in snow up to her knees with what looked like a surveyor's transit mounted on a tripod in front of her. He approached carefully. The girl didn't look up from her instrument, making minute adjustments with the kind of precision that spoke of real training. "That's a surveyor's transit," Jack said when he was close enough. "Where did you get it?" "My grandfather's." The girl's voice was calm, factual. "Henry Blackwood. He surveyed for Union Pacific Railroad." Jack moved closer, genuinely curious now. "What are you measuring?" "Cloud ceiling height." She made a notation in a leather-bound book. "It's dropping 200 feet per day. And barometric pressure." She tapped a small aneroid barometer attached to her belt. "Declining 0.15 inches every 6 hours. That's not a normal weather pattern." Jack felt something shift in his assessment of the situation. This wasn't a girl playing at science. This was trained observation. "Where did you learn this?" Grandfather taught me surveying, basic meteorology. He said mountains are structures. Understand the structure, understand the behavior. She finally looked up at him. Clear eyes, no hesitation. You're Jack Sullivan. You hunt these ridges. I do. Then you've noticed the elk migration is early, the raven gathering patterns, the pine sap production. Jack nodded slowly. I have. It's not coincidence. Clara returned to her transit. These are measurable phenomena indicating a significant weather event. I estimate 17 to 21 days before the primary storm system arrives. And when it does, standard cabin construction in Ashford Ridge won't withstand the snow load. The certainty in her voice made Jack uncomfortable. Not because he doubted her, but because he believed her, and that belief carried implications he didn't want to face. Have you told anyone else about this? My mother and I presented our concerns to several families. They called us hysterical. No emotion in the statement, just fact. Jack watched her work for another minute, then asked the question that mattered. What are you planning to do? Build a proper shelter, one that can survive what's coming. That afternoon, Jack found himself watching the Blackwood cabin from a distance. Clara and her mother Ruth had begun some kind of construction project that made no sense from the outside. They were dismantling parts of their own cabin floor, pulling up boards and digging into the frozen ground beneath. Neighbors walked past, shaking their heads. Jack heard the comments. Blackwood women have always been strange. Girls playing with rocks like a child. Waste of good materials. But Jack had worked construction on railroad lines. He recognized what they were building even before it took shape. A thermal mass heat distribution system. The kind of engineering that required understanding of heat transfer, airflow dynamics, and structural load bearing. He moved closer over the next few days, observing without interfering. Clara worked with blueprints, actual technical drawings that showed cross-sections and measurements. Ruth directed the placement of stones with the precision of someone who understood exactly what each piece needed to do. The foundation went 4 feet into frozen ground until it hit bedrock. Granite for the core because of its heat capacity, limestone for the outer shell because of its insulation properties. The chimney design was vertical with no bends, creating a draft that would pull smoke upward using principles Jack had seen in railroad tunnel ventilation. On the 3rd day, he approached while Clara was calculating stone placement. This is railroad tunnel design, he said. Clara didn't seem surprised by his presence. She showed him a blueprint yellowed with age but precisely drawn. Samuel Thorne's design. He was a railroad engineer, built tunnels through the Sierra Nevada in the 1860s. He designed ventilation systems that could handle extreme cold while maintaining proper airflow. Jack studied the blueprint. The detail was extraordinary. Thorne, I've heard that name. He died around here, didn't he? Ruth straightened from her work, her voice cool. 1876. People called him insane, but his designs are still being used on 4 railroad lines. Something in her tone made Jack look closer. This wasn't just respect for good engineering. This was personal. By the 4th day, the whispers had become complaints. The town council called a meeting. Jack wasn't on the council, but everyone in Ashford Ridge knew when the 14 men gathered at the town hall. He stood in the back, watching Clara and Ruth face the assembled authority with quiet dignity. Warren Frost spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of command he'd learned during the war. Mrs. Blackwood, the council has received numerous complaints about your construction project. We're preparing for winter, Ruth replied calmly. Several men chuckled. One slapped the table. Everyone prepares for winter, Warren said. Clara stepped forward, spreading blueprints across the council table. Her voice was clear, carrying none of the deference a 15-year-old girl was expected to show 14 older men. Cloud ceiling is declining 200 feet per day. Barometric pressure is dropping 0.15 inches every 6 hours. Snow accumulation rate at 8,000 feet altitude is currently 3 inches per day and accelerating. Standard cabin roofs in Ashford Ridge are built to support 40 pounds per square foot maximum load. If current patterns continue, we'll exceed 60 to 70 pounds per square foot within 3 weeks. The room went silent, not the silence of consideration, but the silence of men confronted with something that challenged their fundamental assumptions about who possessed valid knowledge. Robert Hayes, the town doctor, leaned forward. How did you calculate that? Surveyor's instruments, my grandfather's meteorological tables, railroad engineering load specifications. Warren's voice went tight. How old are you? 15, sir. 15. Warren stood slowly. And you believe you understand more than men with 30, 40 years of experience in this country. I don't claim to know more than you, Clara said evenly. I'm simply reporting what the instruments measure. The data doesn't depend on who reads it. Jack saw it then, the tremor in Warren's hands intensifying, the way the older man's jaw clenched. This wasn't just about a girl challenging authority. This was something deeper. Warren's voice cracked. My son Marcus was 16 years old. Winter of 1885. He told me he felt a storm coming. Said he sensed it in his bones. I told him he was being hysterical. Told him not to spread panic. The room had gone utterly still. I found him 200 yards from our cabin, 3 days after the blizzard started, because I didn't believe him. Ruth's voice softened. Then you should believe us now. No. Warren's response was immediate, almost violent. Because if I believe you and you're wrong, this entire town will panic. They'll hoard supplies. The elderly will suffer. Children will go hungry from the chaos. I watched that happen after the war. I will not allow it to happen again. Jack understood then. Warren wasn't rejecting Clara's data because he thought she was wrong. He was rejecting it because he couldn't bear to be right and helpless again. The trauma of losing his son had twisted into a need for control so absolute that evidence itself became the enemy. Mr. Frost, Clara said quietly, you're not afraid of panic. You're afraid of facing the fact that you were wrong before. Warren flinched as if struck. Clara continued, her voice never rising. But you're correct about one thing. I can't save everyone with words, only with actions. The vote was swift, 14 hands raised. Warren's voice was steady when he delivered the verdict, but Jack saw the cost in his eyes. The Blackwood women will leave Ashford Ridge before the first heavy snow. You're creating panic. This town cannot afford that. Clara looked at each council member in turn. When her gaze reached Jack in the back of the room, he felt the weight of his own silence like a stone in his chest. He believed her. He knew she was right, and he said nothing. You're making a mistake, Clara said. That's not your decision to make, Warren replied. Clara and Ruth gathered their blueprints and walked out. The door closed behind them with a sound like finality. That night, Jack stood outside the Blackwood cabin in the darkness. He could see Clara and Ruth inside packing supplies by lamplight. Moving with purpose, not desperation. They had known this was coming. Jack left a package by their door. Matches, salt rope, and a map one he'd found years ago in an abandoned trapper's cabin. The map showed a route to a cave at 8,400 feet. He'd never been there himself, but old-timers had spoken of it. A place Samuel Thorne had used. He didn't knock, didn't announce himself. Just left the package and walked away into the darkness, carrying his cowardice with him. Snow began falling the next morning, not gentle flakes drifting on calm air. This snow came horizontal, driven by wind that had teeth. By noon, the road out of town had disappeared under white. Jack watched from his cabin window as Clara harnessed herself to a wooden sled. Ruth lay wrapped in blankets on top, too weak from weeks of illness to walk. Their cow was tied to the back, its breath steaming in the frigid air. The entire town seemed to be watching. People stood in doorways and at windows. No one helped. No one spoke. They just watched as a 15-year-old girl leaned into the harness and began to pull. Step after step, the sled moved forward. Clara's small figure bent against the wind, dragging the weight of her sick mother and their meager supplies up toward the mountain that loomed invisible in the storm. Jack's hands gripped his window frame hard enough to hurt. He should help. Should at least give them extra food, warmer blankets, anything. But he didn't move. Fear held him in place. Fear of association. Fear of being exiled alongside them. He watched until they disappeared into the white. Just a dark shape becoming a shadow, becoming nothing. The storm intensified as darkness fell. Wind screamed through the valley with a sound Jack had never heard before. Not the usual Wyoming blizzard. Something bigger. Something that made the cabin walls creak and the windows rattle in their frames. Jack lay awake that night listening to the wind, thinking about a 15-year-old girl somewhere on the mountain with a sick mother and a load of supplies that wouldn't last a month. Thinking about his map, hoping she'd found it, hoping it was accurate. Mostly thinking about the look in her eyes when she'd swept her gaze across the council room. Not pleading, not afraid, just measuring. calculating who had the courage to stand with truth and who would choose the comfort of consensus. He had failed that measurement. The wind grew worse through the night. By morning, drifts had buried the lower cabins to their windows. The snow kept falling and falling and falling. Jack pulled on his heavy coat and went to check the woodpile. His calculations said he had enough for a normal winter. But if Clara was right, if this storm was the beginning of something bigger, his supplies would run out before spring. He looked up at the mountain invisible behind curtains of snow. Somewhere up there, Clara Blackwood was either dying or surviving, and when spring came, Jack would have to live with the knowledge of which one it turned out to be and what his silence had contributed to the outcome. The thought settled in his chest like ice. 41 years later, sitting by his fireplace in Montana, Jack would tell his grandson that this moment standing in the snow, looking at the mountain while a girl fought for survival alone, was the moment he understood what cowardice truly cost. Not just the person abandoned, but the person who did the abandoning. Both paid the price, just in different ways. The snow continued to fall on Ashford Ridge. The wind continued to scream. And somewhere high on the mountain in a cave that most people believed was just a trapper's legend, a 15-year-old girl was about to prove that knowledge properly applied was stronger than experience, louder than pride, and more enduring than the harshest winter Wyoming had ever seen. The climb nearly killed her. Not from cold, though the temperature had dropped to 20 below zero by the second day. Not from exhaustion, though Clara's legs trembled with every step by the time she reached 7,000 feet. The thing that nearly killed her was doubt. Her father's voice, 3 years dead, but still sharp in her memory. Don't be a weight on your mother, Clara. Don't be a burden. She pulled the sled through drifts that reached her thighs. The rope had worn through her gloves by the first afternoon. By nightfall, her hands were bleeding. She wrapped them in strips torn from her undershirt and kept pulling. Behind her, Ruth drifted in and out of consciousness. The fever had worsened with altitude. Clara checked her mother's pulse every hour. Weak but steady, breathing shallow but regular. The medical training Ruth had received as an Army nurse during the war had been passed down in fragments. Enough for Clara to know her mother was dying, not enough to stop it. The cow followed without complaint, its hooves finding purchase on ice that Clara's boots could barely grip. She'd tied the animal loosely enough that if it fell, it wouldn't drag the sled down with it. Practical thinking, the kind her grandfather had taught her, calculate the acceptable losses before they become unacceptable. On the third day, Clara found the map. She'd stopped to rebalance the sled's load when she noticed the package tucked into the supply bag. Not hers. The wrapping was oilcloth military grade tied with knots she didn't recognize. Inside was salt matches dried meat, and a map drawn in fading ink on surveyor's paper. The handwriting in the corner made her hands shake. St. Samuel Thorne. The route marked on the map used triangulation points her grandfather had taught her to read. Ridge lines, elevation markers, compass bearings. She pulled out her transit, sighted along the indicated path, and felt something like hope kindle in her chest for the first time since leaving Ashford Ridge. Someone had believed her enough to give her this. She didn't know who. Didn't matter. The map was accurate. That was what counted. She adjusted course 15 degrees east and continued climbing. The cave entrance appeared exactly where the map said it would be, 8,400 feet elevation. A jagged opening in the granite face dark and breathing cold mist into the frozen air. Clara unhitched herself from the sled and approached carefully. No tracks in the snow around the entrance. Nothing had used this shelter recently. She lit her lantern and stepped inside. The temperature changed immediately. Still cold, but 20 degrees warmer than outside. The wind vanished, replaced by stillness, so complete it felt like entering a different world. She held the lantern high. The cave wasn't natural, or rather it had been natural once, but someone had modified it with precision that made Clara's breath catch. The floor had been leveled. The walls showed tool marks chiseled at specific angles. And in the center of the space 40 feet from the entrance stood a stone hearth that made every principle of engineering her grandfather had taught her suddenly make perfect sense. This wasn't a fireplace. It was a heat distribution system. The stones were arranged in a radial pattern granite at the core for thermal mass limestone shells for insulation. The chimney wasn't a simple hole in the ceiling. It was an engineered shaft carved into natural rock with angles calculated to create draw. She recognized the design from railroad tunnel ventilation systems, the kind that could move air efficiently even in extreme conditions. Along one wall stood a stack of firewood arranged in crosshatched layers that allowed air circulation. Railroad lumber storage technique. Still dry after years, maybe decades of sitting in this cave. Beside the wood was a wooden crate wrapped in oilcloth. Clara opened it with shaking hands. Tools. Axe saw chisels, a railroad grade, and beneath them, wrapped in leather, a journal. The first page stopped her heart. Samuel Thorne, railroad engineer, November 1871. She read the next line aloud in the empty cave. Expelled from Ashford Ridge for warnings regarding structural failures. Town rejected calculations. I take refuge here. Cave discovered during Railroad Survey, 1869. Will document proper shelter construction for future use. Clara turned pages, seeing technical drawings of extraordinary detail. Cross-sections of the hearth system. Calculations for heat transfer rates. Diagrams of chimney draft dynamics. This wasn't a diary, it was an engineering manual. She found the entry dated December 1871. My son, Warren, aged 19, voted with the council to exile me. He called my work paranoia. I bear him no ill will. Pride is a disease of youth. Perhaps time will cure him. Clara sat back, the journal heavy in her hands. Warren Frost, the man who had exiled her. Samuel Thorne's son. History didn't repeat. It echoed. Behind her, Ruth's weak voice broke the silence. What does it say? Clara looked at her mother, wrapped in blankets, skin pale as paper. It says we're going to survive. She built the fire exactly as Thorne's diagrams instructed, kindling arranged in a specific pattern, larger pieces placed at calculated angles. When she lit the match, the flames caught slowly, then began to breathe. Smoke curled upward. For a moment, it drifted toward the cave ceiling. Then something remarkable happened. The smoke turned sharply, pulled into the chimney shaft with force that made the fire itself seem to inhale. Heat spread across the stone floor. Clara felt it touch her frozen face like a benediction. Ruth began to cry quietly, not from sadness, from relief so profound it had nowhere else to go. Clara spent the next 3 days implementing every system Thorne had documented. The coal seam was exactly where his notes said it would be, 42 feet northwest, following a vein that ran 6 to 8 inches thick. She used his mining techniques, careful extraction that wouldn't destabilize the cave structure. Coal burned hotter than wood, longer, critical for the kind of coal that was coming. She found the hot spring by following Thorne's map deeper into the cave. Natural geothermal water, warm enough to drink, flowing through a channel the engineer had carved with precision. She cleared 6 years of debris and suddenly had drinking water, heat source, and humidity to prevent the kind of respiratory damage extreme dry cold could cause. Near the spring, in the warm, humid microclimate, pale mushrooms grew in clusters. Clara identified them carefully. Pleurotus austriatus, oyster mushrooms, edible high-protein vitamin D. Ruth's Army medical training had included basic nutrition. Between them, they had enough knowledge to survive. The ventilation system was genius. Thorne had engineered a dual-flow design. Fresh air entered low through cracks he'd carefully enlarged. Warm exhaust exited high through the chimney. The system prevented carbon monoxide buildup while maintaining temperature. Clara adjusted the ratios using Thorne's calculations, compensating for 2 people and a cow instead of 1. Every night she read more of the journal. Thorne's voice became her teacher. His failures became her instructions. The man the town had called insane had built a survival system that would outlast everyone who'd mocked him. In Ashford Ridge, the town was dying. Jack Sullivan watched it happen with the slow horror of someone who knew it was coming but lacked the courage to stop it. The first roof collapsed in late January. The Mercantile, Warren Frost's own building. The snow load had exceeded 65 pounds per square foot, exactly as Clara had calculated. The roof beams, designed for 40 pounds maximum, snapped like kindling. The sound echoed through the valley, a crack like rifle fire, then the long grinding rumble of structural failure. By the time people ran outside, the building had collapsed inward, crushing inventory, destroying supplies. Warren stood in the snow, staring at the ruins of his life's work. His hands shook, not from cold. The Mercantile collapse redistributed weight to neighboring buildings. Basic physics. Load that had rested on one structure now pressed on those around it. 3 more roofs failed in the next week. Each collapse made the next inevitable. Jack did the mathematics with growing dread. They'd lost the mercantile 2-family cabins and a storage barn. At this rate, the entire town would be gone before spring. Robert Hayes, the doctor, came to Jack's cabin on a bitter February morning. "We have scurvy cases," Hayes said without preamble. 3 confirmed, probably 5 more coming. Vitamin C deficiency. We're burning through food stores 3 times faster than normal because people need more calories to stay warm. The livestock are dying. Half the cattle froze when the barn roof collapsed. No milk, no fresh meat. Jack poured coffee. Hayes wrapped his hands around the cup like it was salvation. "Warren's instituting rationing," Hayes continued. 10 logs per family per day. It's not enough to survive on. "I know." Clara Blackwood's calculations were accurate. Jack said nothing. What was there to say? They'd all known it, some earlier than others, but knowing and acting were different things. Hayes stared into his coffee. "I should have spoken up at the council meeting." "We all should have." "You weren't on the council." "I could have been in the room, could have said something." Jack met the doctor's eyes. "We all chose silence. Now we're paying for it." Hayes left without finishing his coffee. That night, Jack found Warren alone in what remained of the mercantile. The older man sat on a pile of ruined lumber holding something in his hands. As Jack got closer, he saw it was a letter. Old paper, faded ink. "My father wrote this in 1875, Warren said without looking up. "Year before he died. He said I'd voted to exile him, and he understood. Said pride kills more men than cold ever will. Asked me to keep his blueprints. Said one day I might need them." Warren held the letter over a small fire burning in a barrel. The paper caught flames, consuming words written by a father to a son who'd rejected him. "I burned his blueprints too," Warren said, "after he died. Couldn't stand looking at them. Couldn't stand being reminded that he'd been right and I'd been too proud to listen." Jack watched the letter burn. Understanding settled over him like weight. Warren hadn't exiled Clara because he thought she was wrong. He'd exiled her because he knew she was right, and admitting that meant admitting he'd failed his father the same way he'd failed his son. Some men couldn't carry that knowledge. The mind protected itself by rejecting truth. "She's dead by now," Warren said quietly. "The girl, up on that mountain." Jack thought about the map he'd left, about Samuel Thorne's cave, about a 15-year-old with surveyor's training and engineering blueprints. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe not." Late February, Jack was tracking elk when he saw the smoke, a thin column rising from the mountainside at impossible elevation. He stood staring at it for a full minute, not trusting his eyes. Nothing should be alive up there. The temperature hadn't risen above 0 in 6 weeks. The snow depth at that altitude would be 20 feet or more. But smoke didn't lie. Something was burning. And if something was burning, someone was alive. Jack turned his trek toward the column. The climb took 6 hours. He used ice axe and crampons, professional equipment he'd accumulated over 12 years of mountain work. Even with proper gear, the ascent was brutal. At 8,400 feet, the air itself felt thin. He found the cave entrance and stopped listening, heard the sound of an axe biting wood. Regular rhythm, practiced technique. Jack stepped inside. The warmth hit him first. Real warmth, not the barely survivable cold of a struggling fire, but the deep heat of a properly engineered system. Light came from a coal fire burning bright and steady in a stone hearth that belonged in a textbook on thermodynamics. Tools hung on the walls with military precision. Food stores organized by type and date. A cow standing in a corner pen, healthy and calm. And Clara Blackwood splitting firewood with axe strokes that showed perfect form. She looked up when his shadow crossed the firelight. No surprise in her eyes, just assessment. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, "would you like some milk?" She handed him a cup before he could answer. The milk was warm, fresh. He drank it while his brain tried to process what he was seeing. How he managed, finally. Clara showed him a blueprint. Samuel Thorne's designs. I followed the instructions. Jack studied the cave setup, the ventilation system, the heat distribution, the organization. This wasn't just following instructions. This was adaptation. Improvement. "You scaled this up," he said. "Thorne designed for one person." You've got 2 people plus livestock. The airflow calculations are different. Correct. I adjusted the intake ratios by 15% and modified the exhaust angles to compensate for increased heat load. Jack set down his cup. The town is collapsing, roofs failing, people starving. I know. How? I predicted it. They chose not to believe me. Will you help them? Clara's pause was long enough that Jack thought she might refuse. When she spoke, her voice carried no emotion. Just fact. Why should I? Because you can. That's not sufficient reason. They exiled me. Jack nodded slowly. They did. I didn't defend you. I was a coward. But there are children dying down there. They didn't vote to exile you. Clara stared into the fire. Ruth watched from her bedding in the corner, silent. Finally, Clara spoke. Tell them this. 1 family at a time. 2 hours by the fire. Then they leave. I'm not offering forgiveness. I'm offering survival. There's a difference. Jack felt something in his chest loosen. Not quite redemption, but maybe the beginning of it. Why, he asked. If you won't forgive them, why help? Clara met his eyes. Because letting children die to punish their parents makes me no better than the men who exiled me for threatening their pride. Principle matters more than revenge. That's what my grandfather taught me. Jack returned to Ashford Ridge and spread the word. 1 family at a time, 2 hours. Children first. The desperate made the climb. Baker family with 3 small children. The Hendersons, the Pratts. Each family came back down warmed, fed alive. Some were grateful. Others felt entitled. Thomas Ridge was the worst. He arrived demanding to know where Clara stored her supplies, insisting he had a right to more than 2 hours. Ruth Blackwood stood between him and the deeper cave passages. Her voice was calm, terrifying in its certainty. This cave has 47 forks deeper in. Without a guide, you'll wander until your lantern runs dry. The last man who tried, we still hear his screams sometimes when the wind is right. It was a perfect lie. Thomas believed it. Fear worked where reason couldn't. 40 families made the climb over the next 3 weeks. Clara saved every one. But Warren Frost never came. Pride wouldn't allow it. Jack visited Warren again in mid-March. Found him in the ruins of the town hall alone, barely conscious from cold and hunger. You have to go to the mountain, Jack said. Warren's voice was barely audible. Rather die. Then what? Admit a 15-year-old was right. Then admit I killed my son. Warren's eyes focused with sudden terrible clarity. I killed Marcus by not listening, just like I killed my father. And now I'm killing this town. I can't, Jack. I can't face her. Jack crouched in the snow beside the older man. Samuel didn't die from the cold. I found his journal. Heart attack, 1876. Natural causes. And his last entry said he forgave you. Warren's face crumpled. What? He forgave you, but you never forgave yourself. Clara is your second chance. Don't waste it. Warren was too weak to climb. Jack carried him. 34 years old, strong from years of mountain work, carrying a 52-year-old man who weighed maybe 130 pounds after weeks of starvation. It took 10 hours. By the time they reached the cave entrance, Jack's shoulders were screaming and Warren was unconscious. Clara stood in the opening, saw Warren. Her face went hard. No. Clara, he's dying. I'm aware. I calculated his probable survival timeline 2 weeks ago. Then you know he needs help. I also know he doesn't deserve it. Ruth's voice came from inside the cave. Clara. Don't, Mother. He exiled us, left us to die. I won't save him. Ruth stepped into the light. The question isn't what he deserves. The question is who you want to be. Clara stared at Warren's unconscious form. Jack watched the war play out across her face. Justice versus principle. Revenge versus integrity. Finally, she stepped aside. Bring him in, not because I forgive him, because I won't become him. They laid Warren by the fire. Ruth treated him with the same precision she'd shown treating Union soldiers during the war. Gradual rewarming. Clean the frostbite damage. Monitor vitals. 3 days later, Warren woke up. Saw Clara sitting by the fire reading Thorne's journal. Why? His voice was broken. Not because you deserve it. Then why? Clara handed him the journal. Read page 47. Warren's hands shook as he turned pages, found the entry dated June 1876, read his father's words. I forgive you. Pride is not a sin, it is a burden. I hope these designs help someone, even if not you. Warren wept, not quietly, the kind of grief that comes from carrying weight too long. Clara watched without speaking. When he finally looked up, she said something that Jack would remember for the rest of his life. You can't bring back your father or your son, but you can stop killing the future. That's the only redemption available. Take it or don't. Your choice, Warren. Warren took it. April brought the thaw. Snow melted slowly from the valley, revealing Ashford Ridge like a body pulled from water. 18 of 23 cabins had collapsed. The mercantile was gone. The town hall roof had caved inward. Barns lay in splinters. Fences had disappeared under ice. 4 people had died. 3 elderly, 1 child. Malnutrition, hypothermia, complications from scurvy. The graves were marked with rough crosses, waiting for ground soft enough to dig. Jack stood in the ruins and felt the weight of those 4 deaths settle into his bones. Clara had warned them, had shown them calculations, had given them time to prepare, and they had chosen pride over data, tradition over truth. He had chosen silence over courage. The survivors gathered in what remained of the town square on the first clear day of spring. 63 people, hollow-eyed and exhausted, standing in mud and snowmelt. Warren Frost walked into the center of the gathering. He'd lost 3 fingers on his left hand to frostbite. His face was thinner, harder, carved by hunger and shame into something that looked like honesty. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. In the silence of devastation, every word carried. I owe this town the truth. Warren's voice was steady but not strong. Clara Blackwood warned us. She had data, calculations, surveyors' instruments. I exiled her not because she was wrong. I exiled her because I was afraid she was right. The crowd shifted. Some looked at the ground. Others stared at Warren with expressions Jack couldn't read. My father, Samuel Thorne, warned me the same way in 1871. He had blueprints, engineering specifications, load calculations. I was 19 years old and I voted to exile him from this town. Called his work paranoia. He died alone in a cave and I never apologized. Warren's voice cracked, but he didn't stop. My son, Marcus, warned me in 1885, said he felt a storm coming. I told him he was being hysterical. I found him frozen 200 yards from our cabin 3 days later. I have killed through pride 3 times, my father, my son, and nearly this entire town. Silence settled over the square like snow. Clara Blackwood saved 40 families, saved me when I deserved nothing. She did this not through forgiveness, but through principle. She's 15 years old and has more integrity than any man standing here. Robert Hayes stepped forward. The doctor looked older, worn down by weeks of treating frostbite and scurvy with inadequate supplies. I should have spoken at the council meeting. I knew Clara might be right. I chose politics over medicine. I apologize to this town and to the Blackwood family. Others stepped forward, one by one. Not everyone, but enough. I voted to exile. I called her mad. I owe her my children's lives. Movement at the edge of the gathering. The crowd parted. Clara walked into the square with Ruth beside her. She looked older than her 15 years. The mountain had carved something permanent into her features. Not hardness, certainty. She stopped in front of Warren, met his eyes without flinching. I don't want apologies, she said. I want action. What action? Warren asked. Rebuild, properly, using my grandfather's designs and Samuel Thorne's blueprints. No more building from experience alone. Build from engineering. Warren nodded. What do you need? Town council establishes building codes, based on calculations, not assumptions. Roof load capacity minimum 80 pounds per square foot. Chimney designs follow thermodynamics principles. Material specifications based on structural requirements, not cost. Done. Mountain shelter designated as public refuge. No private ownership. Open access to anyone who needs it. Done. Clara's voice didn't change tone, but something in her eyes sharpened. And Samuel Thorne's name gets cleared. Full public recognition. Memorial. Proper marker for his grave. Warren's voice broke completely. Yes, all of it. I swear it. Clara nodded once. Then we start tomorrow. She turned and walked back toward the mountain. Ruth followed. The crowd watched them go in silence. Jack approached Warren after the others had dispersed. The older man stood alone in the mud, looking at his ruined town. That took courage, Jack said. Warren shook his head. Courage would have been listening the first time. This is just survival. Sometimes they're the same thing. Warren looked at Jack with eyes that had seen too much. You left her supplies. The map. I know it was you. Jack didn't deny it. Why didn't you speak up at the council meeting? Warren asked. You believed her. I saw it in your face. Because I was afraid, Jack said simply. Afraid of being wrong. Afraid of being exiled with her. Afraid of 100 things that seem ridiculous now. Are you still afraid? Jack thought about that. No, now I'm just ashamed. Warren nodded slowly. At least shame means we learn something. Fear teaches nothing. Reconstruction began in May. Clara supervised using blueprints that combined her grandfather's surveying knowledge with Samuel Thorne's engineering specifications. She was not gentle in her instruction. Jack watched her correct Warren's chimney work on the third day. Angles off 3 degrees, Clara said, checking the measurement with her transit. Warren studied the stonework. It looks straight to me. The instrument says 3 degrees. Rebuild it. Warren pulled down the stones without argument. No resentment in his movements. Just the careful work of a man learning humility through repetition. Jack helped where he could, carrying stones, cutting lumber, following Clara's precise instructions. He was a skilled builder, had worked railroad construction for 2 years before taking up trapping, but he'd never seen building approached with this level of technical rigor. Every roof truss was calculated for maximum load. Every chimney was designed for optimal draft. Every wall thickness was specified based on insulation requirements and structural necessity. Clara didn't guess. She measured, calculated, verified. The new buildings rose slowly, but they rose correctly. Within 2 months, Ashford Ridge had 6 new cabins built to standards that would have seemed excessive before the winter. Now they seemed barely adequate. Clara planted a garden near the cave entrance in June. Not flowers, practical crops selected for cold hardiness and nutritional value. Potatoes that could survive early frost. Carrots that stored well. Beans that fixed nitrogen in the soil. She erected a wooden placard at the cave mouth. Jack helped her set the posts. The sign read Thorne Blackwood Shelter, Public Refuge, No Private Ownership, built 1871 by Samuel Thorne Railroad Engineer, maintained 1889 by Clara Blackwood, open to all who need. Warren carved his father's name into the wood himself. His damaged hand made the work slow, but he refused help. Some acts of penance couldn't be delegated. They held a memorial service in July. Simple. No preacher, just Warren reading from Samuel Thorne's journal. Selected passages about engineering principles, about the relationship between structure and survival, about building things that would outlast their creator. My father wanted to build systems, Warren said, standing over a stone cairn they'd erected at the cave entrance. Not monuments to himself, systems that would work whether people remembered his name or not. That's the only immortality that matters. The thing that continues functioning after you're gone. Clara added a single line. He succeeded. Summer turned to fall. Travelers began arriving at the shelter. Word had spread about the refuge on the mountain. Families passing through Wyoming. Trappers caught by early weather. A surveying crew that got disoriented in fog. Clara welcomed them all with the same policy. 1 group at a time, 2-hour maximum. Contribute labor if able. Leave the place cleaner than you found it. She kept a journal adding to Samuel Thorne's original entries. Names and dates. Who came, what they needed, what they left behind. A record of survival building on itself. Jack visited regularly through that fall and winter. Sometimes bringing supplies. Sometimes just checking in. He found Clara teaching a young boy, maybe 13, how to read a barometric pressure gauge. 3.1 inches means stable weather, Clara explained. Below 2.9 and falling storm coming. You have maybe 12 hours to prepare. The boy absorbed this with the serious attention of someone learning something that might save his life someday. Why are you teaching him? Jack asked later after the boy had left. Because knowledge doesn't survive unless it's passed on, Clara said. Grandfather taught me. Samuel Thorne taught me through his notes. Now I teach others. That's how it works. You could charge for this. People would pay. Clara looked at him like he'd suggested burning the shelter down. Knowledge isn't property, it's responsibility. You learn it, you share it. Anything else is just hoarding. Jack thought about that conversation for days afterward. In his world, men hoarded knowledge, kept trade secrets, maintained competitive advantages. The idea that information should be freely given, taught without compensation, was foreign to everything he'd been raised to believe. But he couldn't argue with the results. The boy who learned about barometric pressure taught his father. The father taught his neighbors. Within a year, 3 families in the region had proper weather instruments and knew how to use them. Knowledge spreading like water, finding its level. Time passed. Seasons cycled. Jack grew older. By 1895, Clara was 22. The shelter had helped more than 200 people over 6 years. The garden had expanded. She'd implemented Samuel Thorne's final blueprint, a subsurface growing system that used geothermal heat from the hot spring to extend the growing season. Technical marvel, potatoes in November. Jack visited on a summer afternoon and found Clara teaching a girl who couldn't have been more than 12. The girl reminded him painfully of Clara at 15. Same serious expression, same careful attention to instruments. "Can you teach me to read mountains?" the girl asked. "I can teach you the instruments," Clara replied. "Mountains teach themselves. You just have to know how to listen." Jack watched them work, saw the pattern clearly now. Knowledge building on knowledge. Clara to the next generation to the future. Engineers thinking. Build once, benefit forever. Warren still visited monthly, brought supplies, never stayed long. The relationship between him and Clara remained what it had been since that spring. Not warm, not cold. Respectful distance built on shared understanding that some wounds didn't heal. They just stopped bleeding. "My father would be proud," Warren said to Clara once watching her adjust the chimney draft on a new addition to the shelter. "Your father was always proud," Clara replied without looking up. "He just wanted you to listen." I'm listening now. 47 years too late for him, not too late for others. Warren worked alongside her in silence after that. No more words needed. Jack saw Warren for the last time in 1910. The older man was 73, worn down by years and guilt and labor. He died quietly in his sleep. They buried him next to the memorial cairn for Samuel Thorne. Clara attended the funeral but didn't speak, just stood in the back watching them lower the coffin. When it was over, she placed a single object on the fresh grave. Samuel Thorne's journal, the original, not a copy. "He earned it," she said when Jack asked why. "By failing his father. By spending 20 years trying to make it right. That's more than most men do." Montana winter, 1929. Jack Sullivan sat by his fire, 75 years old, looking at his grandson across the flames. "So Clara built the whole shelter system?" Thomas asked. "Clara and Samuel Thorne and everyone who learned from the blueprints," Jack said. "That's how knowledge works, builds on itself." "Is she still alive?" 56 years old now, still runs the shelter. I visit every summer. What happened to Warren? Died in 1910, spent his last 20 years helping Clara. Redemption doesn't erase the past, but it changes the future. Thomas was quiet for a moment, then asked the question Jack had been waiting for. "Grandpa, why didn't you defend her at the council meeting?" The silence stretched. Jack had known this question would come, eventually, had rehearsed answers. But sitting here 41 years later, only the truth felt adequate. "Because I was a coward," Jack said. "I believed her, but I was afraid of being associated with her failure if she was wrong. Afraid of exile if I defended her. Afraid of 100 things that seem meaningless now." "But you helped her later." "Later doesn't erase earlier, but it's better than never." Jack leaned forward. "Lesson is this: when you know truth, act on it. Don't wait for the safe moment, because the safe moment never comes. And by the time you find courage, people have already died from your cowardice." Thomas absorbed this, young face trying to understand old regrets. Jack reached into the wooden chest beside his chair, pulled out a leather tube cracked with age but still sealed. "I'm leaving the shelter to you in my will," he said. Thomas looked confused. "But you don't own it." "Exactly." Jack handed him the tube. "That's the point. Nobody owns it. but it needs caretakers, people committed to maintaining the systems. Clara's getting older. The shelter needs someone from the next generation who understands what it represents. I don't know anything about engineering. Clara will teach you, like she taught me, like Samuel taught her grandfather. Knowledge passes down. That's how it survives. Thomas opened the leather tube carefully. Inside were blueprints, original drawings yellowed with age covered in Samuel Thorne's precise handwriting. These are 58 years old, Jack said, and they'll still be relevant 100 years from now, because good engineering doesn't age. Neither does good principle. Thomas unrolled the blueprints, studied the technical drawings, cross-sections of heat distribution systems, calculations for chimney draft, diagrams of load-bearing structures. "This is incredible," Thomas whispered. "That's what happens when you trust data over ego," Jack said. "When you build for function instead of pride. When you create systems meant to outlast their creator." He stood moved to the window. Snow was falling outside, but nothing like the winter of 1888. Nothing would ever be like that again. "People ask me what made Clara special," Jack said. "I tell them nothing and everything. She wasn't a hero. She was just an engineer who trusted measurements more than assumptions. In a world full of men choosing pride over principle that made her revolutionary." He turned back to his grandson. "I'm 75 now. I've seen men die from stubbornness, seen towns collapse from arrogance, and I saw a 15-year-old girl survive because she had the humility to learn from a dead engineer's notes. That taught me something I should have known at 34. Legacy isn't about being remembered. It's about building things that outlast you." Thomas carefully rolled the blueprints. "What should I do with these?" "Study them, learn them, then teach someone else. That's all any of us can do. Pass knowledge forward. And have the humility to admit when someone younger knows more than you. Because knowledge doesn't care about age, only about accuracy." Jack sat back down. The fire crackled. Outside wind moved through the Montana trees, but it was just wind. Not the hunting thing from 1888, just weather predictable and manageable. "That winter taught me what cowardice costs," Jack said quietly. "Not just the people you abandon, but yourself. Both pay the price, just in different ways. I paid mine every day for 41 years. Knowing I could have spoken and didn't, could have acted and chose fear instead." "But you did help eventually," Thomas said. "Eventually," Jack nodded. "And that has to be enough because it's all I have. The map I left, the supplies, finding her alive, telling her story so people remember not just her, but the principles she represented. Data over ego, system over sentiment, truth over comfort." He looked at his grandson, saw the young man trying to understand. Someday he would, when he was old enough to regret his own silences, to wish he'd been braver, to understand that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. "Winter of 1888 was 41 years ago," Jack said. "But I remember every detail, the wind, the snow, the look in Clara's eyes when she swept her gaze across that council room and measured each of us, found us wanting. That look stays with you, teaches you. Even if the lesson comes too late to change what happened, it changes what happens next." Thomas held the blueprint tube like it was precious. Maybe understanding, maybe not, but learning. That was enough. "Tell me about the shelter now," Thomas said. "What's it like?" Jack smiled. First time in the conversation. "Beautiful. Not pretty, understand. Beautiful the way a bridge is beautiful. Functional, precise, serving its purpose perfectly. Clara's maintained it for 40 years, helped 2,000 people. The systems still work exactly as Thorne designed them. The knowledge still passes down, and every person who learns from her teaches someone else. That's immortality," Thomas said softly. "Only kind that matters." Snow continued falling outside. The fire burned low. Jack added wood-watched flames catch. Thought about another fire 41 years distant, burning in a cave at 8,400 feet. Thought about a girl with bloody hands pulling a sled up a mountain. Thought about all the choices made and not made that winter. "I'll go," Thomas said suddenly, "to the shelter. Learn what Clara teaches." Jack felt something in his chest loosen. Not forgiveness. He'd never forgive his own cowardice, but maybe acceptance. Maybe peace with the idea that passing knowledge forward was its own kind of redemption. Good, he said. Take the blueprints, study them on the journey, and when you get there, tell Clara that Jack Sullivan kept his promise. I told the story, made sure people knew, made sure Thorne's name survived. That was my penance. Not enough, never enough, but something. Thomas nodded. The young man stood gathered the blueprints prepared to leave. One more thing, Jack said. When you meet her, you'll think she's just an old woman maintaining a mountain shelter. Don't make that mistake. She's an engineer who changed how an entire region thinks about survival. She's a teacher who's trained 3 generations. She's living proof that the quietest voices sometimes carry the most truth. Remember that. Honor it. I will. After Thomas left, Jack sat alone by the fire. 75 years old, body worn down by mountain years. Mind still sharp with memory. He thought about Clara at 15, at 22, at 56 now. Thought about Warren's 20-year redemption. About Samuel Thorne's posthumous vindication. About all the people saved by a system built on principle instead of pride. Thought about the 4 graves in Ashford Ridge that might not exist if he'd been braver. If he'd spoken up. If he'd chosen truth over comfort. That was the weight he'd carry to his own grave. The cost of silence. The price of cowardice. But he'd told the story, passed the knowledge, given the blueprints to the next generation. It wasn't redemption, but it was responsibility. And sometimes that was all a man could offer. Outside the snow fell soft and quiet. Nothing like 1888. Nothing would ever be like that again. But the lessons remain. The principles endured. The shelter stood. Knowledge built on knowledge. Truth compounded over time. And somewhere in Wyoming, in a cave at 8,400 feet, a fire still burned according to specifications drawn by a man who died before Jack was born, maintained by a woman who'd proven that competence transcends age, gender, pride, and time itself. That fire would keep burning long after Jack was gone, long after everyone from that winter was dust. Because good systems outlasted the people who built them. That was the only immortality worth having. Jack closed his eyes and let the warmth from his own fire wash over him. Grateful finally after 41 years to have told the truth completely, to have passed the knowledge forward, to have in some small way honored the girl who taught him that measurements matter more than assumptions, that principle trumps revenge, and that the strongest shelters are built not from stone and wood, but from the courage to trust what the instruments say, even when everyone else calls you mad. The fire crackled. The wind blew. And somewhere far away in a cave that had saved 2,000 lives, another fire burned, according to blueprints drawn by a man the world had called insane. Samuel Thorne had been right. Warren had learned it too late. Clara had proven it early. And Jack had spent 41 years bearing witness. Now the story belonged to the next generation. The blueprints were passed, the knowledge moved forward. That would have to be enough.